Your deck is probably not as good as you think. In fact, it sucks. And that's because you're making 11 mistakes while building your deck. So today, not only will we go over those mistakes, but I will also review your decks in real time and help you improve them. The first major mistake players make while building their deck is that they have no cheap cycle cards in their deck. Let's take a look at the first deck we have, submitted by Vanderzorg3. While this deck looks decent at first glance, it has two major issues. First of all, you have no cheap cycle cards in this deck. If you're playing bridge spam or cycle deck, you need to have some cheap cards which you can use to cycle back to your win condition faster. Otherwise, you won't be able to outcycle your opponent's counters. Secondly, there's absolutely nothing to deal with ground swarms in this deck. When most of the cards in your deck are countered by swarms, you always need to have a small spell which is good against them. As for what changes are needed in this deck, I would suggest having a cycle card like Heal Spirit in this deck instead of the Firecracker, because she doesn't fit well in bridge spam decks. And having the Evolved Zap or Evolved Snowball instead of Vines will be much better, especially considering that Vines is about to get nerfed. The second major mistake I've seen players make is having too many win conditions in one deck. So here, we have this deck by Peter Hank. Okay, so there is an obvious flaw with this deck. There are 4 win conditions. 4! At most, your deck should have only 2 win conditions, and that too, the ones which synergize well with each other. All the win conditions in this deck have absolutely zero synergy between them. Pick one of these win conditions and build a deck around that. I would suggest ditching the Goblin Giant, Expo, Goblin Barrel, and Prince. Instead, build a balloon deck using reliable cards like Skeletons, Ice Spirit, Musketeer, Tesla, and Miner. The next major deck building mistake is to have cards in your deck that have absolutely no synergy together. Here, we have a deck by Bombardier Caleb. Although I like this deck, I'm not sure what the Bandit is doing in there. You need cards that boost synergy with your deck. Bandit has no synergy with balloon decks. The defense of this deck looks weak. You don't have anything to counter popular cards like Hog Rider or Graveyard. I would highly suggest having a building like Tesla or Cannon in such decks if your defense is weak. Also, you don't need so many small spells. 2 are more than enough. Having a big spell like Fireball can also really help you take care of some beatdown pushers. Apart from that, the Fireball can assist your balloon in getting damage on offense. And if you want to assist me in getting 100k subs by the end of 2025, then hit that like and subscribe button. A very common mistake players make while building their decks is to have spells that don't complement the deck's synergy. Let's take a look at this deck by Harry. This is a pretty solid deck for sure. The only issue here is the spell synergy. If you're already running a Firecracker in your deck, you don't really need both Fireball and arrows in your deck. Something like a Zap or a Log instead of arrows will be much better. For 1 less elixir, you can basically kill swarms for a positive elixir trade. Fireball plus Log will kill almost every troop that Fireball plus arrows can destroy. As for air swarms, you already have your Firecracker for that, so you don't need arrows. Always use spells that will fulfill the role which your other cards can't. This is what makes a great deck synergy. The next mistake is mostly made by beatdown players, and it is not running a card that can reset Inferno units. Take a look at this deck by Deftax. So the first rule with beatdown decks: always have something to reset the Infernos. If you don't have a reset card, you're never beating any deck that's running an Inferno card. Cards like Inferno Tower, Inferno Dragon, Sparky, or Mighty Miner can wreck your deck easily. Also, you need a big spell most of the time with beatdown decks, otherwise it just gets really hard to break through buildings. Only having arrows in your deck won't be enough, unfortunately. And lastly, regardless of whatever deck you're playing, never play too many cards that die to the same spell. For example, in this deck you have Musketeer, Witch, Bomber, and Inferno Dragon, all of which are your main defensive cards, but they all get wiped out by a Lightning. One major change I would recommend for this deck is to have a Fireball plus Zap combination. You don't really need the Inferno Dragon and arrows here. Also, something like a Miner or a Prince instead of the Musketeer would be better to add more offense to your deck. A great rookie mistake players make while building their decks is to not have any air defense. So here we have this deck by Dumdozo. even if you choose to ignore the fact that this deck has 2 win conditions which don't complement each other, there is another major issue. The air defense of this deck is extremely weak. You only have archers and princess, both of which are extremely fragile. A simple fireball or arrows can wipe them out, leaving you vulnerable to lava hounds and balloons. Also, battle ram is really weak as a win condition on its own. If you're playing a certain win condition, make sure to have support cards that will help it get damage. In this case, the battle ram needs cards that can bait out its counters. So cards like Bandit, Royal Ghost, Lumberjack, Dark Prince, etc. are perfect for this role. Have 2 of these cards instead of the Goblin Barrel and Skeleton Army, both of which are extremely unnecessary in this deck. As for the air defense, replacing the princess with something like a baby dragon, electro wizard, or musketeer can work great with this deck. A big reason why your deck is not working well might be because you are not building your deck like it's meant to be played. If you're running a cycle deck, you're supposed to be aggressive and have cheap cards. You don't need to act passively and have all defensive cards like a graveyard player. If you're a beatdown player, you need high DPS cards behind your tank to build a huge push from the back. You're not supposed to have cards which you can spam on the bridge like bridge spam players. Let's take a look at an example. So here we have this deck by Bernardo Miguel. Okay, so the first problem I'm seeing here is a lack of cycle cards. You mostly have 3 and 4 elixir cards in this deck, which will make it really hard for you to cycle back to your Royal Giant quickly. Royal Giant decks rely on outcycling your opponent's counters. It's meant to be played like a cycle deck and not a beatdown deck. Also with this deck, you can have some serious trouble dealing against fast Hog Rider or Ram Rider decks. What I would suggest here is to take out guards and have skeletons in there for a faster cycle. And use the Fisherman instead of the Valkyrie or Mini P.E.K.K.A. The Fisherman can help you with King Tower activations, as well as pull troops away from your Royal Giant, thus allowing it to get damage. The most common mistake players make is not having any win condition in their deck. The next deck we have here is from Juan. Here we see the same rookie mistake. No win condition. How are you even supposed to get damage without a win condition? The defense of this deck is pretty solid, but without a win condition you can't get any damage yourself if your opponent defends well. If you're using recruits, your best chance is always a split lane push, so the best win condition to use with royal recruits is Royal Hogs. The Ice Wizard isn't really needed in this deck because you already have decent air defense and splash damage, so use the Piggies instead of the Ice Wizard. Also, you need a big spell in your deck so that your push can break through on offense. Instead of the Royal Delivery, try using Fireball, as it's much more versatile. A mistake which most players make early on is to run with 2 win conditions, which have 0 synergy between them. Think of something like a Golem and Goblin Barrel. How are these 2 supposed to complement each other? Is your Golem supposed to tank for your barrel? That's literally ridiculous. But now, consider something like a Lava Hound plus Balloon. The Lava Hound tanks for the Balloon, which goes straight to the tower and deals heavy damage. That is an example of good synergy between the 2 win conditions. Let's take another example. Next up, we have this deck by NoQZ7. So this is another perfect case of having 2 win conditions that are totally different from each other. Royal Giant and Miner aren't supposed to be used together because the Miner can't support the Royal Giant in any way whatsoever. He obviously can't take out buildings or heavy cards like P.E.K.K.A. or Mini P.E.K.K.A., which counter the Royal Giant. And because you're using a heavy win condition, you always need a reset card. This deck has no such cards. You need to have a Lightning, Vines, or Zap, always with the Royal Giant, else you can never beat Inferno decks. I would suggest taking out the arrows and having the Lightning in its place. Use the skeletons instead of the Skeleton Army for a cheaper cycle. To replace the Miner, you can have another cheap card like the Ice Spirit. And yes, one more thing. Minion Horde is a shit card because it's always a negative elixir trade. Royal Giant decks need positive elixir trades to outcycle your opponent's counters, so use the regular minions instead of the Minion Horde. They work much better and can give you great trades. One mistake which is often overlooked by players is having too many cards that perform the same role in one deck. Let's take a look at this deck by RV Music. This is another classic example of a bad deck. There is no win condition, no big spell, and no cheap defense units. The cards in this deck also have no synergy with each other. First of all, you obviously need a win condition. But secondly, why do you have the Mega Knight, Mini P.E.K.K.A, and Knight in the same deck? They all are kind of tanks, and you don't really need all of them, especially the Knight. He's too slow for a deck like this. Something like a Ram Rider or a Hog Rider can work well with the Mega Knight. Use that instead of the Knight because he really has no purpose in this deck. You also don't need 3 small spells, which too have the same function. Instead, replace one of them with a cheap defensive card like Guards or Berserker, and replace the other one with a big spell like Fireball. I would suggest keeping the Zap, since it's really helpful to take out swarms instantly. The biggest deck building mistake you can make is actually not knowing how to build a deck. As simple as it may sound, you have to follow a different deck building strategy for every win condition, and yes, you probably don't know what those deck building strategies are, so if you want to learn them, click on this video.